I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which this podcast is recorded, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror.
Dark Mirror with Jessica Ann.
Welcome to Dark Mirror. It is me, your host, Jessica Ann, and I actually didn't anticipate upon recording today's episode just how difficult it was going to be for me to talk about this topic. I knew in my prep that I was finding it quite challenging, but I don't pre-script these episodes. I do them off the cuff with the assistance of some of my notes, which means sometimes key points that I want to make get missed. And so I'm going to jump in and add those things in now. So if you are watching this and you see me with my jumper, that's me jumping in with a post edit. And on the audio version, I'm also going to make it obvious that I am jumping in to add a little bit more detail. But here's the episode. Welcome. Today I want to talk with you about evil, what it is, why this conversation matters, and how those of us that are in positions of leadership get to mature our awareness and how we discuss this topic. Depending on the cultural context you are entering this conversation with, your definition of evil could be very different to mine. And I actually feel that's the value in having this conversation. Because if we're unable to entertain beliefs and ideas that are different to our own, it will lead to the very thing that I'm going to unpack with you here. You also may notice that the title of this episode is called The Banality of Evil. I'll explain why. Not now. Soon. And I also just want to offer a couple of disclaimers right up top. As I was preparing for this episode, I was struck by a few things. First of all, how unprepared I felt to actually have the conversation. I realize how many different perspectives and nuance that I'm not going to be able to give the appropriate gravity and weight to in one episode. And so while I'll be pushing forward on this imperfectly, some of these subjects that I'll be touching on may be deeply personal for you. They haven't been excluded because I don't think that they're valuable. It's because I need to be able to contain this conversation to build upon the conversation and hopefully start to open some doors and windows into this topic. Secondly, I've also been struck by the relevance of the fear of persecution inside this. Some of you may be able to resonate. Coming from an esoteric practitioner, the witch wound inside me in this conversation is very much alive. And so as I share parts of this, it may border on ranting because it is deeply personal to me. However, I'm going to be present and giving the best level of sensitivity that I can when I'm noticing that happening. So let's start with what my definition of evil is. Doesn't need to be yours. However, I feel this is a great place for us to start. And my definition of evil isn't so much about what happens, but rather the context in which I notice evil occurs. The prerequisite or the context for evil is usually always some form of dehumanization. When we are unable to recognize the common humanity in another, it creates the perfect set of conditions for cruelty, callousness, malevolence, and downright destruction to take place. I want to extend this definition to also include other living beings, so whether or not that is animals or ecosystems, but again, to contain this conversation, I really want to center the conversation around human evil, which to me exists right from the very beginning of our ability to dehumanize another. So just to name an elephant in the room, if you are like me, you have been in spiritual communities that outright denounce the existence of good and evil, instead naming it as an illusion, something that is perpetuated by our experience of duality. And while there are sometimes useful aspects to this viewpoint, there are also limitations. One of the conversations that I often unpack when looking at this inside the Artemisia certification is the invention of the atomic bomb. I feel the important place to start with that conversation is the real-life devastation that occurred in Japan as a result of the dropping of those bombs. The mass civilian casualties, the loss of innocent life, and also the intergenerational effects, not only due to radiation exposure, also the intergenerational trauma and the wide-scale destruction of key infrastructure. The pain and the suffering was real and deserves gravity. As a result of that experience, the Japanese government outlawed war, which leads me into my next point. After experiencing the destruction that an atomic bomb could create, we started to think about conflict differently. And on a global level, we haven't experienced that level of direct conflict on that scale since World War II. So the devastation caused by the atomic bomb has actually potentially saved millions of lives. And so, is the atomic bomb evil or is it good? In most cases, it's both. However, what is not helpful or would not have been helpful in that specific instance is to rush or deny the real lived experience of the people that were there. And so, to me, an authentic spiritual practice involves an integration of the human experience, as well as the ability to access that higher order perspective when it's appropriate. Why I feel this conversation is more relevant now than ever is because we exist in a time where it has never been more obvious that we are all the main characters in our own story. Right from the beginning of our awareness, we're existing in our own individual reality that is interfacing and relating to consensus reality. But now we exist in a time where our own individual story is being supported by a media ecosystem, reinforcing the biases and beliefs that perpetuate that story, while simultaneously tugging at consensus reality. And so we exist now more than ever as siloed individuals who are often going unchallenged, which to me create the perfect conditions for dehumanization to occur. Also wanted to be more specific around how going unchallenged in your beliefs make it easier to stop seeing others as fully human. Because often when our beliefs are being reinforced, it's often accompanied with a subtle assumption that people that do not see the world the way we see it are wrong. And often when we see people as wrong, that wrongness through the halo effect starts to be cast onto more than just that specific idea. It becomes what we identify them with. And the more that that goes unchallenged, the more we're allowed to cast people as wrong, and we start to seek confirmation of their wrongness. We begin to pit them as the enemy. So, for those of us that are in the business of people, it's important to know that this is people business. This experience of isolation, validation, reconfirmation, and often a lack of accountability from leaders in those spaces that these people or our people are being siloed into. Which also includes us. Are we aware of how we are participating inside these ecosystems? And are we consciously making an effort to call into questions the things that become normalized? So, to get this conversation back on track, rather than continuing to ask more questions, the reason I wanted to speak about the banality of evil specifically is that one of the main things that I see operating within these funnels or these silos sections of the online space is the shared narratives within these online spaces, some of which happen to be conspiracy theories. These shared stories begin to define who and who doesn't belong within these specific silos or communities. And often these conspiracy theories lead to more damage than what we might first suspect. One of the potential areas of damage that I really wanted to look at in regards to conspiracy theories is the Epstein files. And as I begin to approach this topic, there is already a level of discomfort that is present to me because it is such an emotional issue, obviously for the victims and the people that are directly impacted, but also the collective grief and shock, and sometimes even apathy and lack of comprehension around institutional corruption and how these things could even take place to begin with. And while that is alarming enough in and of itself, what bothers me is how online conspiracy theories often sensationalize on top of what is already an extreme case. When we indulge in conspiracy theories and platform unfounded stories at the same level as real victim accounts, it's what they call, in propaganda terms, flooding the zone. People start to not be able to tell what is fact from fiction. And it also readjusts how we process the information that we are receiving. You guys might have been exposed to this in a sales context, where they talk about presenting the more expensive price first before presenting a cheaper price. What this does is it anchors the value to the higher price point, and it makes the lower price point feel like a bargain. Feel kind of insensitive using that analogy, but you guys might have come across it before. And much in the same way, when we have people sharing sensational, unfounded stories alongside real facts, it adjusts the bar through which we are filtering this information. We aren't giving the appropriate level of gravity to real human stories. We instead spend our time reacting to the sensational. And over time, what was already painful, terrible, starts to look less bad. That to me has a real human cost. When we start to normalize things being worse and worse, these things that were already so painful, that already had a real cost, start to get ignored. And so, why I wanted to bring this up around the banality of evil is that these conspiracy theories are one of the ways that we start to put evil over there. The more extreme, the more sensational, the more out of left field that something appears, the further it feels away from everyday reality. To be clear, what I mean when I say about the established facts of the Epstein case that I feel like getting buried underneath the sensationalism, I'm looking at these thousands of case studies. When I say looking at, from the research that I have done, I'm not sitting there filtering through the emails specifically in all the case documents, but from the large consensus, there are thousands of case studies, thousands of documents that point to trafficking, to child assault, to a plethora of horrible, dehumanizing acts. And yet people need to go reading between the lines, pulling at the sensational and giving it the same level of platform as things that we have documented evidence for. When we come back to my definition, the context for evil to occur is really that ability to dehumanize. And to put it bluntly, a lot of us experience basic dehumanization on a daily basis. The importance is we typically don't exist inside it. If you're someone that experiences road rage and you completely blow up because someone cut you off, that's a fleeting moment of dehumanization, fueled by fear on top of it. When that becomes a place of residence rather than a place of reference, you have got a tinderbox ready for evil. But to ground my point, when stories of real human tragedy aren't allowed or aren't given the platform to be witnessed without people needing to create sensationalism over the top in an internet culture that awards the sensational for views and clicks and rage bait, more and more people slip under the bar. One of the things that I wanted to elaborate on is how conspiracy theories specifically, as opposed to other shared group narratives, can be more likely to cause harm. And I alluded to this, but it is that tugging on the fabric of consensus reality. And while it's important for us to be able to question the assumptions that form our consensus reality. I mean, there was a point in time where we thought the world was flat. However, with conspiracy theories, there is often a preoccupation with subtext, with pattern recognition. And so the more of these assumptions, the more of this quote unquote evidence that we take on, the more that we lend our belief structure to the fantastical. And the harder it is for us to meet each other in consensus reality. And often this can become a spiral that leads us into a reality that is completely separate from consensus reality, where we can very easily scapegoat a specific person or population and dehumanize them. And this is where this conversation starts to depart into something a bit more personal for me. Because one of the most common tropes that I see around the sensationalism, around the Epstein files, yes, but around so many recent human tragedies, is how quickly it becomes about the occult. Now, that's not to say that there aren't people out there that do practice the occult, that are doing things that are unsavory. But when there is a lack of evidence, when these claims are unfounded, and people begin to spin sensationalist narratives around these things, what's not often considered is the people that puts at risk. Because people that become radicalized against esoteric practices, against occultism, rarely are sitting down to consider the intentions of an individual that is participating in those practices. Often they start to dehumanize them. And when someone is dehumanized, as we know, it's the perfect grounds for evil to show up. They're not interested in a practitioner's intention or relationship with those practices because they have deemed them as evil. So they get to assume the position of moral righteousness while condemning the other individual. And it's this exact kind of thinking that led to the witch trials, that led to the Holocaust, that has led to so many tragedies throughout human history. I can't even begin to name them all. But specifically for people that practice alternative forms of spirituality that are misunderstood, they tend to be a very common target. I know I mentioned about how the occult often becomes part of these conspiracy theories. And I'm not just speaking around elite crime stories. I'm also talking about how often this gets reached for to explain specific government actions, to explain celebrity story arcs that often we've constructed in a very parasocial way. And I think the reason the occult keeps getting reached for is, aside from centuries of blood libel, which is a whole other kettle of fish, it's because the occult gives an explanation for what often defies explanation. It provides an external reason that prevents us from having to look in the mirror. There's a very famous saying, which I'm probably going to butcher, about the line of good and evil runs inside the heart of every man. And if we can put evil out there in some occult sect, it stops us from having to look in the mirror at the banality of evil, or the everydayness of it. And rarely does it stay insulated to one specific community. While esoteric practitioners or occult practitioners are a very small group, often when people become radicalized against one marginal group, they tend to get radicalized around others. It's rarely just magical practitioners. This belief, this embedded fear around the occult evil tends to create perfect conditions for other insidious radical beliefs to find their way through. Because just as easily as this information can be twisted to support specific theories around the occult or the esoteric, this information can be twisted to attack other marginal communities, whether or not that's a specific race, religion, sexuality, gender identity, what have you. And so rarely does this discrimination remain limited to one specific group. They may be the scapegoat du jour, but 9 times out of 10, this violence gets amplified. One of the things that I wanted to elaborate on is how I mentioned that radicalization against one group rarely stays contained to just one marginalized group. Obviously, I named the occult inside this, but the reason why this rarely stays with the one group is that when somebody gets radicalized, often it is centered around some righteous or moral crusade. Even considering the Epstein files, a lot of the outcry and a lot of the grief and the hurt is around the fact that this is targeting children. And so when you have a group that takes up the moral crusade of protecting children, anything that could be seen as a threat against those children starts to be called into question. And sometimes that does include people that have alternative sexuality, people that present differently. Whatever it may be, the moral crusade often acts as the catalyst for this radicalization to spread beyond just one marginal group. And while conspiracy theories can feel like a fun little internet trope of whodunit and detective investigation, what's often missed is the real life consequences. Like I said, the extremism and the sensationalism, having real victims not being given the support and appropriate attention that their cases deserves, and their situation deserves, and also the persecution of marginalized communities. Now, if this feels a bit extreme for you, like I said, I've named a couple from the Salem witch trials and then obviously the Holocaust, which are more extreme. And I don't want to put those things at the same level. Two very different things, but both very much founded in this scapegoating. This isn't something that just happens over there. It happens in our communities all the time. One of the cases that particularly hit home for me was the case of the West Memphis Three. If you aren't familiar with the West Memphis Three, it was a case that occurred in the 90s off the back end of the Satanic Panic, which I will touch on briefly in a moment. But it was a case in the 90s of three young boys, all under the age of 10, who were murdered in Arkansas. And there were three teenage boys that ended up being convicted of the murder of those three young boys. You can watch the documentary Paradise Lost if you are interested in the case. But ultimately, how it came to pass is one of the teenage men that were convicted, one of the boys that was convicted of this crime, was persecuted because he dressed in black and liked heavy metal and practiced esotericism. Being in a regional town, that made him an outsider and a threat. And a case was quickly built around him, and he was actually sentenced to death. His name is Damien Eccles. He's an excellent author. But he ended up spending 20 years on death row for a crime that he didn't commit because people painted a picture of evil. People became more interested in their story than the truth. And so much of this was allowed to take place because of the Satanic Panic that happened in the 80s, spurned by texts like Michelle Remembers, which was the retrieval of repressed memories of somebody that reported satanic ritual abuse, which was later found out to actually be her recalling things from horror movies that she had watched at home. Now, that's not to say that satanic ritual abuse doesn't occur, but in this instance, it was given so much widespread gravity and publicity that people became more interested in the story than in the facts. So, what does it mean when we get more interested in the story than we are in the facts? So often the story becomes attractive because it serves so many needs for us, particularly for the inner sect or inner sanctum of people that are building the narrative, investigating, doing their own research. Often this need to seek under the surface to support our story is really looking for control, for novelty, for significance, and in a lot of cases, belonging. When you hear people that are entrenched in these stories and in these conspiracy theories, often there is this sense of being in on something that other people aren't, but often being oblivious to how these stories are actually impacting others. Further to that, this reminds me of an experience that I had during the pandemic where that need for control in a time of such high uncertainty, where we were seeking belonging and insight. and how that was such a perfect backdrop for a supposed documentary that was released, which in many ways has since been exposed as right-wing propaganda. Desperate people accept solutions that meet the needs that they have. And if we're not careful, often the stories that we accept plant the seeds for that exact dehumanization that I spoke about before, as well as adjusting that bar of tolerance. To that end, I feel like it's really important for people to educate themselves around their biases and how often we do exist unconsciously inside these echo chambers and start to question our assumptions. There's a principle in philosophy called Occam's razor, which is really about applying the least amount of assumptions to a situation that we can, and how most of the time that path of least assumptions is more likely to be true. There's value in this because the more assumptions there are, the more we're leaning into the fantastic, which is often where these sensational extreme beliefs come from. So our ability to enact Occam's razor personally is an asset. Another piece that I would mention here is the importance of educating yourself on propaganda and how conspiracy works. ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn has an excellent video on conspiracy. Yes, it's 3 hours long, and I believe it's an investment in really truly understanding what and how we are motivated, and particularly how and why conspiracy theories take hold. On a practical level, I wanted to walk you through how to apply Occam's razor. I'm going to use the West Memphis case because I referenced it earlier. However, it applies to so many conspiracy theories. So, first of all, we want to pull apart some of the assumptions here. The assumption is that the 3 teenage boys coordinated an attack on 3 young boys that they didn't have any personal relationship with. The second assumption is that there was a satanic ritual cult active in rural Arkansas. The third assumption is that listening to heavy metal and wearing black means that you are likely to be involved in that satanic sect. So, without going any deeper, we're already 3 assumptions deep, compared to the assumption that most of these cases are perpetrated by people that know the victims. So, how many assumptions away do we need to get before we get to the idea that these 3 boys are the most likely culprits? So, to summarize, why conspiracy theories concern me is because often they are used as apparatus to dehumanize a specific portion of the population. Once that population or that specific portion of the population is dehumanized, it is the perfect conditions for evil to manifest. So, while conspiracy theories can meet a lot of different needs, the antidote to conspiracy theories is often empathy, Occam's razor, and also our ability to recenter our locus of control. When we are so busy being concerned with things outside of our locus of control, we often seek things to plug the gaps that we are feeling, which is why these stories become attractive. They make sense of what is often a chaotic and unpredictable universe. But when we come back to the things that we can directly impact, when we come back and be really radically honest with ourselves about that which matters and that which we want to change, because we're passionate about it, to start creating a world that we truly want to participate in, things start to shift because we're no longer pouring into things that unconsciously reinforce our sense of helplessness. We can, in fact, be effectual. And that is empowering. I mentioned refocusing your locus of control. And on a practical level, as people in leadership, it means getting really clear on what your personal vision and values are and how, from your current position, you contribute to actualizing more of these values taking place for the people that are dear to you, that value the same, and also for yourself. What actions can I take this week, next month, in the next year that continue to work towards manifesting more of what I want to see in the world? That is recentering your locus of control, decision by decision. Next week, I'll be releasing an episode with Carly Ryan where we talk about how the drama triangle gets perpetuated online, which I feel is a really sister conversation of what we've just talked about. So, my question for you today is, how do you define evil? What are your assumptions and who do you dehumanize as a result? And what would it mean to call into question what constitutes evil? And how often it exists in conditions that are really quite banal and often as simple as Mitch Horowitz would put it, as a life insurance employee denying someone's claim to care that could change their life simply because it's company policy. What's your take? If you've got value from this episode, please let me know by leaving a review or sharing a comment below. Also, my DMs are open. You can find all the ways to contact me down in the show notes, and we will be back next Thursday with Carly Ryan.